I like to think about two questions and the relationship between them. The first question is a very old one, and that is, what is property? That's a question that people have been arguing about for centuries. And it's a question that pops up in some of the papers that are being presented this week, because disputes about who property belongs to sometimes incorporate disputes about what property is in the first place, about how it should be defined. The second question that I like to think about is one that gets much less attention, at least explicitly, and that is, does it matter what property is? And if so, how does it matter? And because this second question is not asked as often as the first, debates over what property is tend to be joined without much attention to what the stakes are, or in fact, without much attention to whether there are any stakes at all. People tend to assume that there's some importance to defining property correctly, but they're often not clear about what that importance is. And that's a shame, I think, in part for the obvious reason that it's worth knowing what's at stake in any debate before engaging in it, but also for the less obvious reason that the answer to the second question may have some bearing on the answer to the first. That is, if we have some sense of why it matters how we define property, how we think about property, if we have some sense about why that matters, that might influence how we think about defining property in the first place. So let's talk about whether it matters first. Now, there's one set of situations in which how we think about property clearly does matter, at least in a very short-term, immediate sense. And these are court cases that turn on the interpretation of legal documents that use the word property. And here, these are examples where, just in the most immediate sense, people argue about what the word property means. So, for example, there are 3 clauses of the United States Constitution that use the term property, use the word property. 2 of them require the government to provide due process before depriving someone of property. The 3rd requires the government to pay just compensation when it takes property. And so there are consequences to labeling something as property, and often there are disputes about whether a particular thing counts as property or not. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In the 1960s and 1970s, here's the first example. Liberal lawyers tried various means of forcing the government to provide more procedural fairness to individuals. One of these efforts involved government decisions about welfare benefits, because the erroneous termination of welfare benefits often had huge effects on the lives of the poor. And the lawyers eventually succeeded at the Supreme Court with an argument that the right to receive government benefits was a form of property, which meant that the government couldn't cut off someone's benefits without providing due process, typically in the form of a hearing, of a chance to prove that the recipient was actually still entitled to receive the benefits. And as a result, welfare agencies now look very different from the way they looked before, because much of their work and much of their budget involves holding hearings. Now, some people think that's bad because money spent on hearings is money that's not dispersed to the poor. Some people think that's good because the recipients win most of the hearings, so we're getting more accurate outcomes. But either way, you could look at this as an example of big consequences flowing from how we define property. Another example, as I'll discuss a little more quickly, are the recent cases involving whether parts of the body are property. When the coroner's office or when a public hospital sells body parts of recently dead people without permission, which happens a surprisingly large number of times, and the relatives sue on the ground that they were deprived of property without due process, okay, here too a court has to think about the contours of a definition of property, and the decision is going to have immediate practical consequences. In these cases, the courts have tended to say that body parts are property, and so they can't be removed without permission. Now, these are examples of litigation that turns on the meaning of the word property in a legal document. There are lots of others, because the word property appears all over the place, in statutes, in contracts, in court opinions. And so if we're looking for situations in which the definition of property is going to make a difference in the world, these look like promising cases. Now, there are also lots of circumstances in which concepts of property might make a difference in a more diffuse sense, and I'd like to give you a couple of examples of those as well. One set of circumstances is the one that Chuck just mentioned, involving the many encounters that European settlers had with indigenous people all over the world during the era of colonization. Wherever settlers went, they saw lots of people, they saw lots of land, and they had to figure out how to obtain the land they wanted. And there are any number of ways of going about it, and I'm going to ignore all sorts of complexities that are immediately going to jump to mind, so bear with me. In broad outline, the settlers had to decide whether simply to take the land, and if necessary, defend it by force from the indigenous people, from their efforts to get it back, either take it, or whether to get the consent of the indigenous people first by entering into transactions with them. One of the factors that went into that decision was whether the settlers perceived that the indigenous people had property rights in the land, which in turn required the settlers to develop a sense of what property was and what sorts of relationships with land should count as property. And this decision was made differently in different places in very broad outline, and again, putting aside all sorts of complexities. Where indigenous people practiced agriculture, settlers tended to recognize indigenous property rights in land. But where indigenous people were hunter-gatherers, settlers tended not to recognize any indigenous property rights. And that goes much of the way toward explaining why some colonial governments entered into contracts or treaties to acquire land, while other governments took land by force. Now, another set of circumstances in which the definition of property seems to have made a difference in a diffuse sense involves the process of technological change, which sometimes creates new kinds of assets that haven't existed before. And how the law treats those assets often depends, at least in part, on whether they're classified as a kind of property. So I'll give you one example. A good example is the electromagnetic spectrum, which of course has existed for a very long time. Right, since the Big Bang, I suppose. But the spectrum could not be exploited for gain by humans until the invention of radio in the early 20th century. The radio spectrum quickly filled up with broadcasters who were constantly interfering with each other until finally the government stepped in and created the licensing system for broadcasters that we still have today. But what about the broadcasters who were already using wavelengths that the new system allocated to others? Was that their property? And when a radio station received a license to use a particular frequency, could the station sell that right to someone else? Was the right to use this portion of the spectrum a kind of property? And these sorts of questions had to be answered in the early days of radio. And the answers that were chosen influenced the structure of the radio industry. Similar questions arose later with the development of television, and then pagers, and then mobile phones. Same questions. Each time, the way we defined property possibly had an influence on the structure of the industry. So I've given some examples there of circumstances in which the question of what property is seems to have had real consequences, either in an immediate sense in driving the outcomes of litigation, or in a more diffuse sense in having some broader effect on outcomes out there in the world. But now I'd like to look at those examples again, but this time broadening the frame a bit and think about how much those consequences actually mattered. That is, in these situations, is it really the definition of property? Is it really the understanding of property that's doing the work? Or would we have gotten to the same outcomes regardless of how we define property? To begin with, I don't think there's much doubt that as a logical matter, we could get to the same outcomes regardless of how we define property. So in the case of welfare benefits, for example, it would certainly be possible to provide hearings before terminating benefits, even if benefits weren't classified as a kind of property. That might make good sense. Even if it wasn't compelled by the Constitution, it might be something majority of people would want. In the case of body parts, we could easily prohibit coroners and hospitals from messing around with dead people, even if body parts weren't a form of property. That's pretty clearly what most people would want. In the case of settlers and indigenous people, there's no necessary logical connection between the recognition of indigenous property rights and the use of transactions rather than force to acquire land from indigenous people. It would have been possible for settlers to decide, well, those indigenous people have property rights in their land, But heck, we're going to seize it by force anyway because we're just so much more powerful than they are. That's actually a pretty accurate description of what happened in a lot of places. It would also have been logically possible for settlers to decide, well, those indigenous people don't have property rights in their land, but nevertheless, we're going to refrain from taking their land without their consent for some other reason. And in fact, a lot of early American government officials took that position. They favored purchasing land from the Indians rather than seizing it, not because they thought the Indians had property rights in it, they didn't, but because in the long run, they thought it would be just a lot cheaper to buy the land from the Indians than having to fight wars against them. And for the electromagnetic spectrum, we could come up with whatever rules we like to govern the allocation and transfer of broadcast rights without worrying about whether the spectrum is a form of property. The larger point here is that just because an issue involves property doesn't necessarily mean that how we resolve that issue bears any relationship to how we define property. As a logical matter, we could get to any outcome with any definition of property. Property is just one mechanism for getting to any particular result. And so the question remains, even if there's no necessary logical connection between concepts of property and real-world outcomes, in practice, has there actually been a connection? That is, in these examples, how confident are we in the explanations that I gave earlier? How sure can we be that decisions about what property is actually had an influence on things that happened in the world? That's a question that I find very hard to answer. I think the best way to demonstrate my confusion is to run through each of the examples again, but this time look a little bit more skeptically at the claim that concepts of property played a significant role in determining outcomes. So let's take the welfare benefits first, right? So one way to describe what happened, and probably the conventional way to describe what happened, is to say that the Supreme Court declared that the right to receive government benefits is a kind of property, that this decision triggered a constitutional requirement of due process, that welfare bureaucracies were irrevocably altered as a result to produce a judicialized system in which nothing can happen without a hearing. On this account, the question of what property is looks extremely important. But there's another way to look at that story, right? It would be plausible to say that all of this would have happened anyway, even if no one had ever argued about whether the right to receive government benefits is a kind of property, and that this is how you would tell the story. The middle decades of the 20th century were a time when Americans in all sorts of contexts began to expect to be treated fairly by the government and began to claim a corresponding right to redress when treated unfairly. Government officials who enjoyed vast realms of unchecked discretion in around 1950 were hemmed in by rules by 1980. So think about the police, prosecutors, prison guards, hospital workers, teachers, and so on. All these people who had all sorts of discretion in 1950 were being sued a lot by 1980. They were governed by all sorts of constraints that had not existed 30 years earlier. All sorts of institutions whose internal workings had once been relatively sheltered from the law were increasingly opened up to legal scrutiny. Most of that took place without any attention to the definition of property. So if lawyers and judges hadn't redefined property to include government benefits, we might imagine that there would have been some other mechanism by which welfare administrators were put under the same scrutiny as other agents of the government, like police, prosecutors, and so on. In fact, in this example, we can have a pretty clear idea of what that alternative mechanism would have been. For many years before the 1970s, when the courts decided what the Due Process Clause requires, they tended not to inquire too closely into whether property was involved. Rather, they tended to look more generally at the fairness of procedures, given the importance of the interests at stake, regardless of whether those interests fit into a definition of property. And so the change in welfare bureaucracies that took place in the 1970s could easily have taken place within this framework, within the older framework, without under the assumption that due process was an obligation that attached to all government activity, regardless of whether a claimant had lost any property. Meanwhile, if we shift our focus away from the formal structuring of welfare departments and ask about the effect on welfare recipients themselves, it becomes much harder to find any effect at all. welfare recipients at the end of this process were still poor and still mostly poorly educated. Invoking the right to a hearing was difficult and time-consuming, so the large majority of recipients never exercised the rights they possessed on paper. The hearings that did take place were conducted by the same overworked welfare departments that made the initial eligibility determinations. The system became more bureaucratized. Social workers exercising discretion were by and large replaced by clerks applying inflexible rules. But the experience of most welfare recipients probably didn't change all that much. So on this account, all the arguing back and forth about whether welfare benefits were a form of property, it was just talk with negligible practical consequence. So that's another way to look at this episode. Okay, is it more persuasive or is it less persuasive than the account that I gave earlier? I'm not really sure. Let's take the second example about property in parts of the body. So earlier I told a story in which body parts got defined as property in order to prevent unscrupulous employees of hospitals and coroner's offices from selling off body parts without permission. I should say UCLA Hospital, every 5 years there's scandal at UCLA Hospital because people are selling off body parts. It's a recurring problem. In any event, so body parts get defined as property in order to prevent hospitals and coroners from selling off body parts. But that's not the only way to shut down the market in body parts. To advance the same goal in other contexts, courts and legislatures have refused to define body parts as property on the theory that if it's not property, you can't sell it. So for example, here's a big example. There's a federal statute that governs organ transplants that makes the sale of organs a felony. That's why you can donate your organs, but you can't sell them. As Henry Waxman, my congressman from the west side of Los Angeles, argued in the hearings that led to this statute, human organs should not be treated like fenders in an auto junkyard. Right? That is, we shouldn't treat them as property. And if we look back at we look back at one of the legal dilemmas of the 19th century, the analogous problem in the 19th century, it becomes clear that this is an issue that could be resolved without resorting to concepts of property at all. In the second half of the 19th century, the corresponding issue, the big issue, was whether corpses are a form of property. On the one hand, it seemed wrong to say that the human body could be a kind of property. It seemed to smack of slavery. They didn't use the word commodification in the 19th century, but it was a bad instance of commodification. There was something sacred about the body. You shouldn't treat it as a form of property. On the other hand, if a human body wasn't property, what would prevent someone from stealing a corpse? It wouldn't be theft, because the supposed thief wouldn't have taken anyone's property, right? Or what would happen if an undertaker, instead of burying a corpse properly, decided to mutilate it or to leave it out on the highway? He wouldn't be liable for interfering with any property belonging to the next of kin. So this was a big dilemma in the second half of the 19th century. It ended up being resolved by just dispensing with the idea of property altogether and saying that thieves and negligent undertakers would be liable to the next of kin, regardless of whether a corpse was property. Okay, so what's the relationship between property and body parts and the practical consequence that hospital employees can't sell off bits of cadavers without permission? Again, I'm not sure. It strikes me as a hard question. The acquisition of land during colonization, I think, poses an even harder question. There were huge differences in how English settlers perceived the property rights of indigenous people in various places. Just to pick one very stark comparison, in Australia, where the Aborigines were hunter-gatherers, the settlers treated the land as free for the taking and recognized no property rights at all in the Aborigines. At approximately the same time, in New Zealand, where the Maori were farmers, English colonial law recognized the Maori as owners of all the land, and the land was acquired in a series of purchases. For a time, one could say that outcomes for the Maori were different from and better than outcomes for the Aborigines. But if we extend the time frame a bit, that difference starts to disappear. By the end of the 19th century, so after a century of colonization, the Australian case, 2/3 in the New Zealand case, the Maori occupied a social and economic position in New Zealand not much better than Aboriginal Australians, and to the extent that it was better, it's not obvious that land policy made much of a difference. Or to pick another example, the Indians of the state of Washington, whose land was formally acquired by treaty, were not much better off than the Indians of California, who were basically hunted down like animals. And again, to the extent that they were better off, that was due to a range of factors within which land policy may not have been especially prominent. But if we extend the time frame even more, the difference reappears. So today, colonial land policy may actually be even more important than it was when it was nominally in effect, because it serves as the basis for indigenous peoples' land claims in court, and some of those claims have been very successful. So far, the Maori, for example, have been paid hundreds of millions of dollars to settle land claims, while Aboriginal Australians haven't received anything close to that, because they didn't have treaties. Right? The Indian tribes of Washington state have an important role in the commercial fishing industry because of fishing rights included in treaties signed in the 1850s, while the Indians of California have no comparable rights because they had no treaties. So when we look at things that way, it appears that ideas about property have had important consequences in the world. But if we open our window still more broadly yet, things become murkier. Are the Indians of Washington state today better off than the Indians of California? Probably some are and some aren't, right? Depends on who we're talking about. And if we consider all the factors that have contributed to the relative well-being of the two groups, what percentage of the cause is attributable to differences in land policy in the 19th century? I have no clue, right? I'm guessing nobody else does either. It's certainly plausible that the lingering effects of differences in 19th century land policy are negligible today, and that to the extent the two groups are differently situated, the important causes are things like current political organization, right, or successful casinos. If we ask the same question about Australia and New Zealand, my sense is that on average the Maori are better off than Aboriginal Australians. But again, it's a very hard question to assess the role that land policy played in that, as opposed to factors like the extent of intermarriage between Maori and Europeans, the percentage of the population that identifies as Maori, even the technological edge that Maori had over Aboriginal Australians before European contact. So in the end, what has been the consequence of property? I'm not sure. And I'll be quicker with my fourth example, the electromagnetic spectrum, because I know I'm beating this point into the ground, but I'll do this one very quickly. The right to broadcast on a particular frequency has long been identified, long been explicitly defined by statute as something that is not property. And the main reason has been to prevent a few large companies from buying up all the broadcast rights and dominating the airwaves. So we could say that the decision not to treat spectrum as property has influenced the structure of the radio industry. But if we look at the question the other way around and ask, what have been the main determinants of the structure of the radio industry? It's not clear that the licensing scheme has made all that much of a difference. That is, the industry might be just as consolidated among a few major players today as it would have been under a system that treated spectrum as property. So here's the broader point I'm trying to make. Property is a mechanism for achieving various outcomes, but in any given case, it's very hard to tell how important the mechanism is to the outcome. With each of these stories, it's possible to give a plausible account in which the same outcome could have been reached by some other mechanism without invoking ideas of property at all. So does it matter what property is? Well, maybe it does sometimes, but maybe not as much as it seems to. Sometimes it depends on how broad or narrow a frame we want to put on events. Okay, so that's one question about whether it matters how we define property. Now let's turn to the other question. What is property anyway? Law professors and philosophers have been debating this question for a very long time. These days, the debate involves issues like, is property best understood as a bundle of rights or best understood as a single right? Is the essential attribute of property the right to exclude others, or is its essential attribute that it's a right against the whole world as opposed to a right against particular people? Is intellectual property really a type of property, or is it really something else? Right? There's a lot of effort that goes into arguing about questions like these. I've never been much of a fan of these debates. And I'll tell you why. They all take as their starting point something that seems dubious to me, and that is the idea that property is the kind of thing that has a true nature. No, I'm not trying to be all postmodern. I'm willing to assume that lots of things have true nature. So if you say, what's the true nature of oxygen, right? That to me is a sensible question. Oxygen has a true nature. But the difference between property and oxygen is that oxygen is something with an existence and with characteristics independent of what people think about it, right? Well, property is a human practice that can have whatever characteristics we want it to have. So in this respect, I think property is like basketball. It's something that we create and something that we can change whenever we want to suit our purposes. A debate about the essential attributes of property sounds to me just like a debate about the essential attributes of basketball. So let's suppose that I say the essential thing about basketball, right, the thing that makes a game basketball as opposed to something else, is that you have to dribble the ball, right? And you say, no, no, no. The thing that makes the essential thing about basketball is that you have to put the ball in the basket, right? That would be a stupid debate, right? And the reason why it would be a stupid debate is that there's no such thing as basketball out there in the world independent about what we agree on as being basketball. Right? It's just like property. There's no such thing as property out there in the world, independent of what we agree on as being property. So let's imagine we go to a foreign country where they play a game where you score by shooting baskets, but you don't have to dribble the ball. Is that game basketball? Well, in some ways it is, and in some ways it isn't. Right? How we choose to, whether we're going to call that game basketball depends on what our purpose is in answering the question. So if our purpose is to decide whether to let that country's team use their own rules in the Olympics, right, the answer probably is going to be no, that game that they're playing is not basketball. Right? But if we're making a list of, say we're making a list of the 10 best shooters among all basketball players in the world, and there's someone in that country who's like just a fantastic shooter, right? So the question is, we want to put that person on the list. We might say, okay, yes, that person is playing the game of basketball. Right? In both cases, we have reasons for picking a particular definition of basketball. In the Olympics, obviously, it wouldn't be fair for one team not to have to dribble, right? That would be too easy. So for that purpose, the game is not basketball. But if our list of basketball shooters, if we want to give credit to someone who's a really good shooter, even though they don't dribble, right? Okay, for that purpose, the game is basketball. Our understanding of basketball is not an end in itself. It's a means to some other end. And when that other end changes, right, so too will our understanding of how to define basketball. I think the same is true of property, right? So let's imagine we go to another planet and the people there grow crops in a big common field and they all harvest them together and share them. Okay, do those people have property? Right? Well, in some ways they do, and in some ways they don't, right? It all depends on what our purpose is in asking the question. So if we're trying to decide whether we can seize their land and seize their crops away from them, by force, right, then we might conclude, no, they have property, right? So we shouldn't take their stuff away from them. But if we're trying to decide whether one of them has the right to withhold land or crops from one of the other ones of them, right, we might conclude, no, they don't have property. Right? Again, it all depends on what our goal is. The point is that property is not a phenomenon out there in the world independent of us. It's a means to an end. It's something we create, and different people have different ends. So at any given time, different people will have different conceptions of property. The goals that people seem to think are worth pursuing change a lot over time. And so we've had different conceptions of property in different eras. So let's go pick a few stark examples. So compare 1700 to today. In 1700, it was obvious that other people could be a form of property. And it was obvious that public office could be a form of property. Right? Today, of course, it's exactly the opposite. We find slavery unthinkable, the sale of public offices unthinkable. It's just absurd to think that they could be property. Right? It's exactly the opposite. And then let's look at some examples in the other direction. In the year 1700, it was unthinkable that one's public image could be a form of property. Right? It was unthinkable that the sound of a song could be property. Right? Again, today it's exactly the opposite. Right? The ability to own and sell one's public image, it seems perfectly natural. Right? Or the copyright in music, it seems perfectly natural. Right? So the reason for these changes in our ideas about property is that we have different goals today than we had in 1700. The notion that our ideas about property are formed for instrumental reasons in order to achieve particular goals, I think is easier to see when we look back at debates that are now safely in the past. Right? And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples now of what I mean. One of the big changes in thought about property in the 19th century in both Britain and the United States was the change from people thinking about property as a thing to thinking about it as a bundle of rights in a thing. So the latter is now the dominant view among lawyers, although the older view still persists colloquially. So colloquially, we might say, this pen is my property, right? But in a strict sense, we would reserve the term property for my rights in this pen. So I have a right to exclude you from using the pen. I have a right to sell the pen. I have the right to give the pen as a gift, and so on. And that all those rights together is what people, lawyers anyway, typically mean today when they use the term property. And so that raises the question: why did this become the conventional view in the 19th century rather than the 18th century or the 21st century? Right? Some of the people who first promoted the bundle of rights idea seem to have been motivated by nothing more than a desire to think clearly. So the first systematic, influential discussion of the issue was by the English legal philosopher John Austin, who I don't think had any ulterior motive involved. But other people had used the term property in a similar sense before, and it never really caught on. Right? But it caught on in the late 19th century. And so the question is, what happened in the 19th century to make this definition of property so appealing when it hadn't been earlier? Now, one possibility is that in the late 19th century, there was a sudden upsurge of genuine interest in this pure truth. But I doubt that, right? I don't think that's true. I think it's usually a good idea when you're trying to explain a change in thought to figure out who stood to benefit from it. In this case, it's pretty clear. In the second half of the 19th century, the regulatory state's expanding in all sorts of directions. Property owners are looking for strategies to fend off regulation, and it turned out that one strategy that was very useful was to argue that regulation was unconstitutional as a taking of property. Now, most regulation didn't literally take property in the older sense of property as a thing. So to pick one example, lots of cities started requiring buildings to be set back a certain distance from the street to make the street look nicer, make neighborhoods look nicer. Under the old definition of property, this would not have been a taking of property because the city wasn't taking any land from the owner. The owner owned just as much land after the regulation as before. He just wasn't allowed to build on part of it. But under the new definition of property as a bundle of rights, the owner could argue that his property consisted not of land, but of the right to use land. So that when the city deprived him of the right to use that rectangle of land between his house and the street, it was taking his property. Property owners in the second half of the 19th century had a powerful incentive to think of property as a bundle of rights to stave off regulation. And I think that's the best explanation for why lawyers began thinking of property this way in the late 19th century rather than the late 18th or the late 20th centuries, right? So here's an example of a pretty fundamental point about the nature of property, but adopted for instrumental reasons, right? It's adopted to achieve a particular goal. Here's another example. In the early United States, people tended to describe property as a natural right. That is, they tended to say that property is something that doesn't come from the law or from the government, but rather is something found in nature, something that pre-exists the creation of law and the formation of government. Over the 19th century, that conception gradually shifted toward the prevailing idea today, which is that property is something created by law. And there were any number of reasons for that shift, including most prominently the gradual decline in the idea of natural law generally. But one interesting thing about the shift is that there was a time in the late 19th century when the two views were both within the realm of professional respectability. And so you can look at the debate and figure out who took which side. And when you do that, it becomes apparent that both sides were deploying these arguments instrumentally, either in favor of greater regulation of property or against it. People who wanted more regulation had an incentive to minimize the naturalness of property. If property was something created by law, well, the new law could modify it in response to changing conditions. What law gave, law could take away. On the other side, opponents of regulation had the opposite incentive. In order to ward off regulation, they argued that property was a right of nature, so that too much regulation would be contrary to natural law. I'll give you just one more of these. One more. It's the classic debate about the nature of property. It's one that Emma actually refers to in her paper, and that's the debate that took place in the 17th century over whether one could own portions of the ocean. The leading players were Hugo Grotius on one side and John Selden on the other, at least the way the debate has survived in the present. Grotius argued that the very nature of the ocean rendered it incapable of being reduced to possession. It was just too big and too vast. While Selden argued that the ocean was just like a big lake or like a big river. And, you know, people could own lakes or rivers, so why couldn't they own the ocean? Now, Grotius turned out to be the winner, although, as Emma points out, Selden's side is making something of a comeback these days. But the thing I want to emphasize about this debate is that Grotius and Selden were acting instrumentally. They were, in effect, lawyers representing clients. Grotius was defending the freedom of the seas on behalf of Dutch traders who wanted to trade in the East Indies in areas that Portugal claimed as its own and trying to shut the Dutch out. Selden was defending ownership of the seas on behalf of the English government, which was trying to prevent foreigners, including the Dutch, from fishing in the waters around England. So again, property is being deployed instrumentally. So again, here are some pretty fundamental debates about the nature of property, and in all of them, the nature of property was an instrumental question. That is, people adopted one idea of property or another because it would help them achieve a particular policy goal. I think we can see this process taking place in some of the papers that are being presented this week. I'm just going to mention one that really jumped out at me, and that's Emily's paper about how people in Seneca Falls are starting to reconceptualize property as a collective resource for financing community services, as opposed to a private resource to be exploited for the owner's own benefit. And the paper makes the reason for this shift pretty clear. Their property taxes go up every time land is acquired by an Indian tribe, because Indian tribes don't have to pay property taxes. Right? I'm guessing the folks in Seneca Falls weren't quite so collective-minded before the Cayugas could afford to buy land. Right? So they're forming their ideas about property to serve a particular goal, in this case, the goal of forcing the Cayugas to pay property taxes. Now, I don't want to overstate the point about property's instrumental nature. It would be too strong to say that ideas about property are completely malleable to suit whatever goals we might happen to have. So even if it were in someone's interest to argue, say, that property means only things that are blue, right, or only things that are triangular, that start with the letter J or something like that, right? Those would not be plausible arguments, right? I don't think people would stretch the concept of property so far. So there are limits to how we would define how property can be defined, but those limits aren't found in nature either, right? Those limits themselves change over time in response to whatever goals people think are worth pursuing, right? So again, take slavery as an example. Today, it would be beyond the limit of rational discourse to claim that one can own other people as property, right? In 1700, it would have been close to the limit of discourse to claim that one couldn't own other people as property, right? So the limits themselves on what are reasonable arguments, they change a lot over time. Again, instrumentally in response to what people want to do. Okay, so to get back to the questions that I started with, here are the answers. First, what is property? And second, does it matter? The answer to the first question, I think, is that within limits, property is whatever people want it to be at any given time to advance the interests that they want to pursue. The second question, does it matter? I don't know. I'm not sure. There are times when it might matter as a mechanism for achieving those interests, but it's just one mechanism among many, and it's very hard to tell how important it is relative to all the others. Okay, and with those very mushy conclusions, that's it for me. So maybe are we going to open it up to Q&A? Yeah.